If there were to be one figure outside the Bible who had the greatest impact on Christianity, it would, I dare say without a doubt in my mind, be Constantine the Great. Now yes, Christianity was already a world religion by the time of his reign. The Kingdom of Armenia had become the first officially Christian state in AD 301, 5 years before Constantine was crowned emperor at York in 306. Christianity was well established in Ethiopia. Also, if you moved east from Armenia, there were the established churches in Persia, the historic churches in India. And according to one Christian apologist who died in AD 330, Christianity had already reached China. Christianity has never been a simply European Roman Empire-based religion, and we must never lose sight of that fact. Indeed, I intend to make sure that this church history series gives significant time to early world Christianity. But at the end of the day, compared to the vast size of Roman Catholicism, Protestantism and Eastern Orthodoxy, though in terms of raw numbers of people who follow them, these other churches are a tiny minority on the world stage. The churches which ultimately converted a third of the world population to following Jesus and giving themselves the names Christians are those indebted to Constantine and the legacy of the Roman Empire, whether it's the European colonizers or the massive bear that is and was Russia. It's only appropriate, therefore, to dedicate a whole session to Constantine. Indeed, you can't really tackle the Council of Nicaea in AD 325, remember that date always, without first speaking of the man and the myth who made it possible. So, who was Constantine? What did he do and when? And was he actually a Christian? Well, let's start with an overview of his life and a lay of the ground, a lay of the facts, before thinking to draw any conclusions on the latter question of was he a Christian, a question which in the West we seem obsessed with answering, but a question which would only produce laughter if you were to ask Christians from the Eastern Orthodox churches, where Constantine is not known as Constantine the Great, but as Saint Constantine. He is seen as the foremost Christian king, a King David-like figure appointed by God to lead his people on earth as a Christian emperor. He's considered to be a saint and a Christian beyond any question. To deal with Constantine, though, we do have to wade through quite a bit of Roman politics and history. You just can't avoid this. But I will try and keep the number of names to a minimum to reduce confusion. After all, with very similar sounding names in many cases, it all does get very complicated during this confusing time of church and world history. So let's pick up where we left off our last session, the little piece of the church, during which the councils in Antioch took place, and where persecution not only ended, but the Emperor Aurelian was even approached to decide on matters of the church regarding who should be bishop in Antioch. Aurelian died in AD 275, and after this were a series of very short-reigned emperors, until a man named Diocletian would usurp the throne and begin what was known as the Great Persecution. He became emperor in AD 284, and in AD 303 he started the Great Persecution. Thousands upon thousands of Christians were martyred, churches were burnt, books were burnt, homes were confiscated. It was a dark, dark time in the church, but the church would not be suppressed. The persecution only ended in AD 311 under Diocletian's successor, who recognised that it achieved nothing in terms of bringing Christians back to the paganism of the empire. The most important thing, though, for our purposes, is that Diocletian recognised that Rome was weak, too weak to continue as it was, crippled by wars and major plagues, and simply it seemed too vast a size for any one man to restore to glory, one man in a single seat of power to rule over. And so he introduced what would be known as the Tetrarchy, which literally means the rule of four. How best to explain the Tetrarchy? Essentially, Diocletian took the vast Roman Empire and he split it in two. There was the East and there was the West. And in both the East and the West, there would be a senior and a junior emperor. The senior emperor was known as Augustus, and the junior emperor was known as Caesar. And each Augustus and Caesar would control a part of their half of the empire. Thus we have four rulers in the empire in four major divisions. On a side note, but not an unimportant one, the old system of Roman provinces was also redone. By the end of Diocletian's reign, there were 100 provinces in the Roman Empire, and there needed to be some level of bureaucracy between the 100 provinces and their rulers and the four tetrarchs who ruled their respective lands. And so the empire was split into 12 dioceses, and each diocese was led and overseen by a vicar. Familiar language? Constantine continued this system, and this language of diocese and vicars would make its way into the church in terms of how it split up its authority and areas of control under bishops. Bishops would have dioceses, often fitting quite closely to the Roman civil diocese, and under the bishop would be smaller sections split up, led by vicars. So, to compensate for having a single seat of power be too unwieldy, and in order to try and stop too much power being centred in one man, the empire was split into four main sections: 2 senior emperors, 2 junior emperors. In AD 306, Constantine the Great's father died in the Roman city of Eboracum, modern-day York. If you go to York Minster, there is a statue of Constantine there, because on the death of his father, the Roman army there declared Constantine Augustus, senior emperor of the Western Empire. None of the other emperors agreed. What followed would ultimately be years of politics and intrigue before finally civil war. The ruler in Italy and North Africa, one Maxentius, began mobilising troops in AD 312 and fortified the Italian side of the Alps against Constantine, on whom he then declared war. Constantine's advisors urged caution. All the pagan soothsayers and oracles said the omens were bad. But Constantine was confident that he was supported by, as he would call it at the time, the Godhead, or the holiest and highest heavenly power. He ignored the advice, and taking just a tiny fraction of his total army that he could muster if he waited, he daringly crossed the Alps with just 40,000 men. The Italian Emperor Maxentius at first hid behind the massive walls of Rome, destroying the bridges across the Tiber River. But then, following the advice of pagan soothsayers who said, "Tomorrow the enemy of Rome will be killed," he marched out of the city to face Constantine in battle. With at least double the numbers, including the elite Praetorian Guard, Maxentius crossed a temporary bridge he made across the Tiber, and with his forces arrayed in front of it, he prevented Constantine from marching on the city. When Constantine's army arrived, his soldiers carried strange standards. Strange symbols were painted on their shields. It was a symbol that was little known at the time, even among Christians, and it is known as the Chi Rho, the first 2 letters in the Greek alphabet of the word Christ. This is what it looked like, although in reverse perhaps. Chi and Rho, placed on top of each other, the Chi Rho. This is the symbol that Constantine would use throughout his reign. Now, the accounts that led to him placing this strange and barely known symbol are a bit muddled. But it seems in hindsight that most likely, on the eve of battle, Constantine saw in the sky a great cross made of light. And that night he had a dream in which the Lord Jesus promised him victory and told him to place his sign on his troops, saying, "In this sign, conquer." It's worth bearing in mind that at this point in Christian history, neither the Chi-Rho nor indeed even the cross were prominent symbols in Christian art. Most Christian art, such as it was either of a fish or a good shepherd figure, or women at the tomb, or Old Testament motifs such as the three saints in the fire in the furnace from Daniel. To this day, those words allegedly from Christ, "In this sign conquer," remain a prominent motif in Christendom. For example, if I show you the symbol of the British Royal Army Chaplains Department on my preaching scarf, you will see those very words right there, "In this sign conquer." So, with the symbol of the Most High Godhead on his army, Constantine won a stunning military victory. His military genius was showing through every step of the battle. Maxentius's forces were decimated. Those who tried to flee were too close to the river and they drowned, including Maxentius himself, who drowned in the river as he fled. Constantine was now the sole ruler of the entire western half of the Roman Empire. Upon entering into Rome in victory, Constantine neglected to visit the pagan shrines and offer unusual sacrifices. Pagan gods were not his gods. In the largest basilica or public meeting hall in the Roman Forum, Constantine had a stone statue of himself erected, holding up the symbol of the Chi-Rho, with the words, "By this sign, Constantine has freed Rome from the yoke of the tyrant." Constantine would make an uneasy peace with the Emperor of the East, who had likewise won total control of his domain from the other emperor there. And together they would finally, officially, end the persecution of Christians in the empire with the Edict of Milan in AD 314. Not only was the persecution ended, but all property was to be returned to the Christians. The state was to pay and reimburse any financial or loss of goods upon Christians during the reign of Diocletian and before. Being the favoured of Christians, however, it was only a matter of time before the Eastern Empire reneged upon the Edict of Milan. At first, it was the sacking of Christians from high office in the army. Then the bizarre prohibition of men and women attending worship together. Then a ban on worship indoors, with it only being allowed outside on the outskirts of settlements. There was also to be no meeting of bishops and clergy, no synods. Eastern prisons became filled with Christians, but Christian ministers were forbidden from ministering to prisons. Due to this and other factors, Constantine and the Eastern Emperor finally came to fatal blows in AD 324. Constantine would win a series of impressive battles, and in September 324, the Eastern Empire surrendered. Constantine the Great had now united the entire empire under his control, under the control of the sign of Christ. Following a vision from God, Constantine would abandon his plans to build a new capital on the old site of Troy, and instead chose the Greek city of Byzantium. There he would be massive on the expansion of this city, tripling it easily in size. He would fill it with shrines to saints and martyrs, and fill it with churches both great and small. Paganism was all but banned from the city. Bronze statues of the Good Shepherd or Daniel in the lion's den would adorn public wells. Constantine ordered 50 massive copies of the entire Bible to be published from Caesarea, something which would take the skin of at least 5,000 cows, an immense cost in money. He poured money into churches all over the empire, especially in Jerusalem, which surviving Christians there pointing to the place where Jesus died and was buried, and so the Holy Sepulchre Church was first built. Pagan temples had their state support withdrawn and quickly fell into disrepair. They had their slate and statues taken at that point and repurposed or melted down and reused for the Christian building projects across the empire. Some major centres of the occult, like at Mamre, were simply destroyed by Constantine as being too evil to continue. Pagan soothsayers were forbidden from sacrificing animals in the homes of others, essentially meaning they had to work from home. It was illegal to offer pagan sacrifices in support of Emperor Constantine. Huge sums of money were given to bishops and churches across the empire. Now, two major church events occurred during this time. The first was the Donatist controversy in North Africa, which we will deal with when we look at Saint Augustine. But for now, suffice it to say that Constantine sided with what he called the Church Catholic, and he made the Donatist churches outcasts without right or authority. Back in AD 314, just a few years after his battle against Maxentius and the giving of the Chi-Rho symbol, Constantine would remark to the Donatists that the disputes and schisms they were causing in the church gave those men, that is the pagans, reason to scoff, whose souls are strange to this all-holy worship. He would also say, "You are asking me to pronounce judgment, whom myself await the judgment of Christ." The second major issue that would rise is what is known as Arianism. To tackle this, Constantine convened the First Ecumenical Council in Nicaea in AD 325. Only possible because he personally bankrolled the expenses of the entire meeting and delegates, ensuring their safety as well. This is a council which we will look at next week. Now, Constantine would die in AD 337, being baptized shortly before his death. Something strange to us, and people often say that proves that he wasn't really a Christian, but it was surprisingly common in the church till the end of the 4th century. Indeed, we've already seen this issue being addressed and discussed in the likes of the Shepherd of Hermas and Tertullian. It was widely believed that baptism cleansed one from all sins, and in this sense, being baptized just before death, when there's no more time to commit further sins before you meet your Lord and Saviour, has got to be a good thing. It's a logical but mistaken presumption. Given all the above, it's not hard to see why Constantine is lauded as a saint in the East. But it is worth remembering and keeping in mind that he was, at the end of the day, a genius politician and military general. He was a shrewd despot. He didn't hesitate to give his opponents the death penalty to ensure his future safety, sometimes even killing the children of his opponents after having them in slavery where they could be no threat to him, it seemed, but might be further down the road. There were a number of such purges throughout his time since his coronation in York till his death. He was known to have sudden changes of mind and mood, to be quick to anger, even to violent rage, only to have deep regrets over his behaviour afterwards. Towards the end of his reign, he would also turn against the death penalty and regret his use of it earlier. This political prowess, though, is what has led many in the West to question the authenticity of his faith, of his Christianity, saying he only claimed it for political gain. Personally, I think this is unlikely. He was openly calling himself a Christian not long after the battle against Maxentius. More significant, though, is the apparent stupidity of putting all of his eggs in the Christian basket when he did. In AD 312, shortly before he's throwing everything behind Christianity, It's generally accepted that at most, Christians made up only 10% of the population of the empire. Likely it was less, around 7 or 8%. This is not the size and kind of group that you would put your life and reputation and money on. Either Constantine was a near impossible genius with incredible foresight, or he was convicted by something to do what he did. The stunning reality, though, is that by AD 350, just 40 years later, over half the empire was likely Christian. This works through various means, but it works basically just by saying that the church grows by 40% every decade, going back to the time of the apostles, not an unrealistic growth rate given the history of religions. The growth, therefore, was exponential, but it wasn't apparent until it became meteoric. A bit like how coronavirus cases go slowly, and then because of how it spreads so quickly, it rises very steeply all of a sudden. Of course, such mass conversion was undoubtedly helped by the generous state support of Christianity. Under Constantine and his successors, if you wanted power and influence, you had to be Christian. And so began what is known as sacralism, something which would dominate the Christian church in Europe till well after the Reformation. Sacralism is, simply put, the conflation of the church and the state until they become indistinguishable. And this was clearly how Constantine saw things when he said, "You, that is the church, have installed bishops for the inner affairs of the church, and I have been installed bishop by God for its outer affairs." But for Constantine, there was no clear line between inner and outer affairs of the church either. Church policy was unable to be separated from state policy, even in foreign policy, and vice versa. Constantine is a complex figure whose shadow covers nearly all of subsequent church history, for better or worse. The impact that he had on the church is almost beyond comprehension and imagining. And so a few questions to close. Do you think Constantine was a Christian? Could a Christian order the deaths of his political opponents? The percentage of the empire which was Christian shot up from around 10% to over 50% between AD 300 and AD 350. What impact do you think this is going to have on the belief and practices of the church? Sacralism was to dominate the church in the empire from this point onwards, and still does today, at least in theory, in places such as England and the Vatican City. It's also seen in modern-day Russia with their new constitution. Do you think God appointed Constantine to instigate an expressly and politically Christian empire? Given the growth of Christianity, with or without state support, do you think sacralism was inevitable? Is it inevitable today?